Thank you for joining Panaseer and our guest for today's webinar, Navigating the New Norms of Cybersecurity Leadership. At Panaseer, we work with hundreds of security leaders each year to publish a Security Leaders Peer Report, taking an annual pulse on what's keeping CISOs up at night. My panelist today is Andy Piper. Andy, please introduce yourself.
I'm Andy. I'm the CISO for the Investment Bank and Markets Division at Barclays Bank.
Welcome. Thanks for joining.
No problem.
As I mentioned, every year we produce a security leader peers report. This year was our 5th report, where we had over 400 security leaders answer questions around what's trending in the industry and what challenges they're facing in 2025 and what to do about them. Over the past 5 years, we've seen changes around control failures, cyber hygiene, additional complexities around regulations, additional board scrutiny, and needing to provide more assurance around reporting. Being a security leader is hard, and today I'd love to talk to you about what we can do about it, what approaches we can take, and how we can look out for our teams. So, with the need to increasingly demonstrate cyber and digital resilience in new legislation across the US and the EU, security leaders are working tirelessly to report and comply. Our SLPR report found that 70% said that there were too many unknowns to have a clear picture of their risk, and nearly half of those that we spoke to weren't confident that what they reported to the board was fully accurate. So when we think about board reporting for a second, what's your approach to reporting? Is it scalable? And is there an inherent level of risk that you take on when it comes to reporting, or are you looking for full accuracy?
I think so. What I learn in this role particularly is the people that are on the boards of a bank like mine are generally not particularly techies. They're financiers, they're investment bankers, they're people who have spent their career not talking about the ins and outs of cybersecurity. So a huge part of my role is to explain what's going on in the industry or in our threat landscape or our control landscape in ways that they will actually understand. And there's no point me going into one of the boards talking about the intricacies of a new, TTP. They don't care about that. They pay me to care about that. What they want to know is, how's that going to impact their business? What risks are they taking on? Ultimately, in investment banking, are they in the market? Can they trade? And if not, when are they getting back in the market? So everything that I do, I have to phrase in a manner that means something to the board. And that's both in the sense of informing them of things they should know about, as much as getting them to understand priorities and ultimately agree to pay for solutions. So everything has to be couched in the terms of the things that the investment bank will understand. So with the increasing scrutiny from regulators, with the increasing sort of general awareness of cybersecurity in sort of the general population, they've started to ask me more questions about cyber. So a couple of years ago, talking to the board would have been, this guy from securities turning up, this is the chance to switch off for a minute. Actually, now they're pulling me into the board to ask me questions because they've seen other organizations getting ransomware. They've heard about supply chain attacks, and they want to know, are we safe from them? What do we do about them? So a lot of my board stuff now is helping them to understand why things that happen to other organizations may or may not happen to us. Mm-hmm. And then to your point on accuracy, you're always as good as what you know, right? So I think, the organization has got good telemetry. We've got good tooling. We know what's going on out there. Is there a chance that some new 0-day sneaks past that we don't know about? Sure. But that's the nature of security. And again, I think that's important to help the boards understand that perfection maybe isn't the aim. It may not be commercially sensitive. It may not be commercially viable. It may not be the right idea at all, but it's where you draw that line. And particularly for my world in banking, there's a level of pragmatism you've got to apply there. So we want to allow the bankers to trade. Mm-hmm. Too many controls adds too much friction, that slows them down. So where do we draw that line? I think that's a conversation that's very live in my industry.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit more about that. I know that, for a while now, cybersecurity as an overall space folks have been looking at how do we enable people to get work done while remaining secure versus how do we shut things down, right? And it sounds like you're touching on that there, right? That like we can't create so many controls and so many limitations, especially given the speed of the market you're in. Does that equate with a level of acceptable risk that you're willing to take?
Yeah, absolutely. And so everything that we do is a balance. Is the control that we're putting in commensurate with the risk? Do we feel like we are putting in a control that's adding too much friction to someone's day? Is it not adding enough? But all of that is done in conjunction with a discussion with the actual sort of bankers of the business who are going to live this. And there are some cases where, you might think we could put a tighter control in place, but it wouldn't be the right thing to do for the organization because you run the most secure bank in the world, but no one will ever trade with it. So where do you draw that line? And it is a constant balancing act that we have a real dialogue, and that's really what I see my role as CISO being. Increasingly the CISOs are not hands-on techies. We're not there putting cryptography solutions in place. We're not there coding things. We're there to be that pivot point between the business and technology and security to say, how can we best do this? What are our requirements that we need you to do? What are your requirements that you need from us? And to really have those exec level conversations around how to take that forward.
Yeah, and so I'd love to kind of pivot a little bit and ask about what role does assurance play? So in our report, 2/3 of our security leaders said they don't have the tools to effectively deliver the assurances that are being demanded of them, right? So as much as it's about a balancing act, there's also this idea that the organization wants to feel assured that the things in place are working and that you have a good handle on that. And so coming along with that is reporting, right? So what is your approach to reporting? How much time would you say you and your team spend reporting? And is it something that is, a larger project than you'd like, or do you find that you have a balance there as well?
I think it's really critical to what we do. So we spend a lot of time on reporting, and it's something that personally I put a lot of stock into because, as I say, the role is largely one of translation, one of relationship building, of stakeholder management. So our reports have to be built in a way that achieves the aim we're seeking to achieve. If it's an informational report, it's got to inform. If it's seeking to just give a whole bunch of data about key risk indicators, then let's contextualize those. So there's a target line. If we're above the target, is that good? Could we be better? Should we be better? If we're below the target, how are we going to get that back up to where it should be? But all of those things with the context and the background of the investment bank. So there's colleagues in my organization that work for other banking divisions, retail, corporate. They'll have a different spin on how they put the data together. So yeah, reporting's huge. It really is. But it's one of the more valuable things that we can spend our time doing because it's how we generate the relationship with our stakeholders and how we explain things in words that mean something to them. So I have a team of people that do it. I think it's something that we should focus a lot on as an industry. We need to get better, I think, at being able to describe the so what's, and as my team will have heard me say, the so what next. So okay, it's a big problem. Okay, what are we doing about it? Or it's not a big problem. It's okay because. And unless we are able to do that, I think we're in danger of being sort of the old school view of security, who are just bunch of nerds and geeks in the corner who do something and leave them alone. They're all right. That's not the reality anymore, obviously.
Yeah, absolutely. And that context, to your point, right? When we're talking about, regulatory pressures and board reporting, they need that context, right? You can no longer just show them a stoplight chart and hope that that's sufficient to move forward. Totally
Absolutely.
makes sense.
And I think one of the other things is, what is success? Like we need to be really clear on what good looks like. So I think if you look at this sort of taking the reporting and the KIs away for a minute, the security team have to be successful every single time. The threat actors need to be successful once. And in a world of increasing automation, in a world of AI, in a world of all the different tools and techniques that may be available for threat actors, I think monitoring success as never getting compromised is probably a little unrealistic. Ultimately, for most organizations, unless you are, governmental or super secret or critical national infrastructure or whatever, compromise is almost inevitable. So a good measure of success may be, how do you deal with that compromise? How do you respond and recover? How do you contain and eradicate? So moving to the right-hand side of the NIST framework, so less identify and detect, more protect, respond, recover. That, I think, is a conversation the industry should be having around, why are we measuring everybody on what may be impossible to achieve? Let's measure us on our response.
Absolutely. Yep, absolutely. Right. It's not a matter of if, it's when. And so do you have the proper mitigations in place and are you prepared? Yep, I totally agree. Let's talk about regulations for a second. In speaking with a handful of CISOs, conversations come up around compliance versus security, right? And is that a trade-off, or is it something where you can successfully feel like you're always managing both? Talk to me a little bit about the role that regulation plays in your space. Do you find it a help or a hindrance? Do you have to balance between compliance and security, or, is that something where you feel like you can faithfully cover both?
So financial services, highly, highly regulated industry. We have investment banking in 40 different countries, and that gives me incredibly over 70 different regulators who have an opinion. So yeah, it's a huge part of my job is to understand and manage the regulatory landscape. And not every regulator sets the bar at the same place. And not every regulator necessarily phrases the same controls in the same way. So you've got quite a lot of interpretation to do to go, where is the bar that we have to meet across these vast jurisdictional differences? So we do focus on it a lot. In our industry, it's not a question of compliance or not. It is, you must comply or you will ultimately be sanctioned, and that can be very significant. Industry fines in banking can be hundreds of millions. So there's no appetite to not comply with regulators. It's a question of, how do we make sure that we are doing? And again, we have a team of people whose focus is on making sure that we do that. It is increasingly complex, I think, as more and more regulators wake up to the reality of the increasingly significant threat landscape that exists out there. So, DORA is very real. There are other EU regulations coming. There are US regulations on AI coming. There's a whole raft of things that are already out there, and we have to be ready for each and every one of them. Now, in some cases, you can use techniques of like mapping against one particular framework, and then that framework will map against others. So if you're ISO 27001, you can map that against NIST, you can map that against PCI DSS, you can map it against, whatever. So that's an option that's available. Pick a framework, make sure that you adhere to that, and then map it onto everything else. Alternatively, what I've seen at some places is if there are specific requirements. So I talked about PCI DSS a moment ago. If there's a specific requirement for payment cards, ring fence your payment card infrastructure and application set, and make sure those are particularly compliant to that. And you don't have to worry about that everywhere else then, because you've ring fenced your environment. So that's something I've seen the industry do a few times, is to be quite specific about which applications come under which jurisdictional requirements and which regulatory requirements, and quite deliberately build the environments to meet those things.
That makes sense. And then you touched on, compliance and policies around different things, and you mentioned AI. If you don't mind, let's just dive in for a second.
Yeah.
So, what is your organization's posture on AI? I know, especially in highly regulated industries, there's a lot of watchful waiting going on. I'd love to understand, how you're thinking about it, how you're thinking about, implementing it or bringing it into the organization or not.
And this is a good example of that balance that I was talking about, right? The investment banking industry is an agile industry. They want to be first to market with new technologies, because that ultimately is where you steal the march on your competitors and you innovate and make the latest, greatest technology thing. Now, machine learning is not new. So the investment banking has had algorithmic trading for a decade plus, right? And those are computers deciding what to trade and making the trades, and obviously humans keep an eye on it, but ultimately there's a computer deciding how to trade. So conceptually, the industry is okay with it. We found ways of getting comfortable. We found controls that we can put around it. I think what people call generative AI, so we've got AI today, they mean generative AI. So there's a slight difference there. And even, over the last couple of days, the new AI out of China is causing a lot of angst in the industry. So I think watchful waiting is the right way of putting it. Generally people are saying, we have to get comfortable with this. We're going to have to use it because everyone else is going to use it. But how do we use it safely? How do we put the proper controls in place around it? How do we make sure that the risks, back to my point earlier, are properly balanced? There's going to be a residual risk from this. It's going to be a risk we are looking to tolerate, but how do we reduce that risk to a level that we can tolerate it? And that's what I think everyone's looking at the moment. And then the other side of the AI conversation is not so much security of AI, but AI for security. So how can we use AI techniques to respond in AI time to threats? Because you can bet your threat actors are going to start launching AI-based attacks soon. So what do we do as a security industry to prepare ourselves for those and to respond to those? And again, I think it's very early days yet on what that might look like, but it's kind of inevitable that we're going to have to find some way of responding at the sort of speeds and the fractions of a second that these things are going to be working at. Humans can't do that.
Yeah, I completely agree. And it's exciting to be here at the kind of early days, right, at the start of this AI evolution and whatever comes from it. But yeah, a lot of questions on how exactly it's implemented properly. But you're absolutely right. I mean, once threat actors figure out how to use AI in a very sophisticated way, we're all going to need to make sure we're already there with some defenses.
And we're seeing some of that now, right? So deepfakes are increasingly capable. A few years ago, a really good deepfake was a nation state capability. Didn't really have to worry about them in most situations. Now you can download a tool off the internet that will do a really good vocal deepfake. Video deepfakes are not far behind. Still got a little bit of that uncanny valley stuff about them at the moment, which lets you spot them. But you're not a million miles away from those being very, very credible. And then we have to change the way that we think about responding to those. Phishing is another good example. As I talk about changing the way we think we respond, we've trained our users for a long, long time to spot phishing attacks on poor quality English, bad grammar, misspelled words. That's not got. Your AI tools will write a perfectly worded phishing mail. So all the triggers that we've trained our users to look for, probably irrelevant now. So what are we going to train them for next? How are we going to tell them to spot an AI phishing email or a deepfake? They're working on it. I think that's the industry as a whole is grappling with these things right now.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've talked a lot about kind of, the different demands placed on the CISO organization. And in the SLPR report that we put out, we had 41% of our security leaders claiming that they're more anxious, 15% considering leaving the industry altogether, and about 50% saying that they're just more cautious than they were a year ago. And so take me through a little bit, how do you keep your teams motivated? How do you take care of them, right? What, for you in your role as a CISO, how do you just combat with the intense pressure and stress of the role?
It is undeniably a stressful role. And I think some of what we talked about earlier around measuring ourselves on perfection it exacerbates some of that a little bit. I think, the way that I sort of think about it with my team is you have to build sort of psychological safety with your team so they can feel comfortable to tell you, hey, this is a lot right now for me, or, there's something else happening that we need to talk about. And have no fear of speaking up. And I think that's something that you really have to work on building with your team, because if somebody sees something that's a weakness but doesn't feel empowered to talk about it, then we're going to find a gap down the line that we should have known about. So at all levels of the organization, you want everybody completely comfortable to call out things that they've seen, to talk about gaps and to talk personally, you know, on the sort of mental health side of actually, this has been a really long week for me. I have things going on, you know, we need to have a bit of a chat about how I'm feeling. So I consciously make an effort to do that sort of stuff. And then on the other side of sort of personal pressures, I think it does take a degree of sort of self-discipline. So I mentioned earlier, there are 40 countries that the investment bank operates in. So that means any point of the day or night, someone is awake somewhere in the world that could have some sort of issue. So yes, I've got local people in all these areas, and there are teams that are designed to be awake at the right time, and our security operations center follows the sun and all these things. But ultimately, if someone needs me, they can call me. Mm-hmm. But it does mean that I have to be quite, as I say, disciplined with myself to say, it's reached a point of the day now where I'm going to turn off and I'm going to stop. And unless something really significant happens, I'm not touching this again until tomorrow morning. I've tried different ways of doing that. You know, I've tried sort of constantly having the phone with me and just looking at it all the time. Actually, I'm better if it's away somewhere. Mm-hmm. So I'm not looking at my computer screen. I'm not looking at my corporate phone. I'm just keeping myself, you know, doing something else. And I find, you know, personally going to the gym helps. So I go to the gym, I work out. If I'm sort of lifting weights or something, I physically can't be thinking about work. So that helps me. So having something else that forces you to have that sort of mental break and to take the mental load down, I think is really helpful. And then, you know, holidays are important. You know, so when you're off, I'm quite strict with myself. You know, I give a lot of myself when I'm in the office. When I'm out of the office, I'm out of the office. You know, people have numbers to get hold of me when I'm on holiday. And if something really serious kicks off, then they've got a way of getting hold of me. But most people, if I'm on holiday, I'm out for a week, 2 weeks, and I'll deal with anything on my return. And again, I find I need that break to deload.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I know. Just listening to how many countries that, you know, the bank operates in and all the different types of regulations. I mean, it's truly a global organization that feels like even a larger job, right, than a CISO for just a national company that isn't as, put upon. I mean, that's a lot for sure.
And you got to have a really good team. That's the other thing, right? You got to have a really strong team of people that you can trust to deal with it when you're not awake. So I'm lucky. I've got a really strong team. Barclays invests a lot in security, so we've got a team of really capable specialists who will run this stuff. And if I'm not personally online, that doesn't necessarily mean it's degraded or anything. It will all carry on. It just means I'm not paying attention at that point in time. So yeah, I think having a really strong team around you that you trust to do it is also important, because that lets me decompress, because I know I can trust my guys to have dealt with it.
Yeah. And would you say, a lot of the feedback that we got in our report this year around, teams spending too much time on reporting or worries about the trade-offs between compliance and security, it sounds like at Barclays, to your point, security is so important that the resources are appropriately allocated, right? You mentioned having a reporting team and compliance teams. And so do you find that that's typical compared to other roles that you've had as CISO, or is it a bit more unique?
I mean, I'm lucky that I work for a very large organization. Mm-hmm. I know that. And we have a very large security team, and therefore we can have these specialisms. If I was at a smaller organization where we were wearing multiple hats, the reporting guys were having to do it, I can see how that would be very challenging, because if you do have somebody whose sort of, primary role is to keep the bank secure, always on, trading, but their ability to do that is compromised because they're spending time putting PowerPoints together. Yeah, I could see how that would be a challenge. I'm very lucky in my organization is that we have quite a lot of scale.
Yeah, that's pretty fantastic. Also, just regarding the risk appetite, you were talking about having to translate technical risk into business terms to report back to the board and that kind of thing. Given that investment banking is just inherently kind of a more of a risky organization, do you find that there is more appetite for how cybersecurity and the risk of cybersecurity fits into the larger risk picture? Or not, I guess, or is it even more of a concern? I ask that because I think that In different industries, sometimes cybersecurity isn't sort of held at the same level, right, as a business risk. There is no assumption that it's being taken on the same way that, we're taking on funding. You make risks every day in business.
Yeah.
And so, how do you find that at Barclays?
I think the regulations help.
Mhm.
So the fact that we're so highly regulated, the industry, financial services industry as a whole, has an expectation of security. And the regulators have an expectation of security. So the senior leadership around board tables understand that, if our regulators are pressing us on cybersecurity issues, then they're clearly very important. And as I sort of mentioned earlier, there's no ifs with regulations, you comply. I think, the fact that in the Financial Times you'll read about security events also helps because, people who are not directly technologists or cybersecurity specialists are seeing the impacts of security weaknesses, and I think that helps as well. And I think more generally, boards are getting more informed around security and seeing it as a bigger problem. So that's all very helpful in the sense of making sure the right messages are landing. Boards ultimately care about their risk position and their competitive edge. And that's probably about it. Everything else comes under one of those two banners.
Mhm.
So if cyber will affect their competitive edge, absolutely care about it. If cyber affects the risks, absolutely care about it. But I think it's an interesting debate around is security necessarily a differentiator? And I think in some cases it's a negative differentiator. But would a hedge fund do work with one investment bank because they're more secure than another investment bank? Or are they more likely to go for the price of the deal or the customer service or the salesman or whatever else? So I think, a lot of us CISOs, it's a bit of a bitter pill to swallow sometimes, but security is an expectation, a baseline. And if you don't have it, it's a problem. But very rarely is it truly a differentiator. And that's not just the banking industry, So think about something completely different, streaming companies, Amazon Prime, Disney, Netflix. Do you go and have a Netflix account because Netflix are more secure than Disney Plus? No, you go for wherever the content's better, right? So something that I've sort of talked about in the industry in the past is actually, where do you show that security is a competitive edge? And does it need to be? And therefore, good enough is good enough. And what does that actually mean? And that's, that would depend on an organization to organization. Where do you draw that line of what is good enough? Because anything above that starts to become a cost. And unless you can defend that cost as a business benefit, the cost benefit doesn't stack up. So, I could go and spend millions and millions and millions and millions of pounds putting some fancy schmancy technology into the bank. But actually, if it doesn't provide a benefit that is commensurate with the effort and the spend, or the friction that I put into the day of the person using it, then it's going to be an uphill battle for me to explain why we need to do that. So I think that's the other thing that is increasingly becoming a key skill for CISOs is how you explain what you need to do in that concept of business benefit. So I said right back at the start of translating it into the right way, it is how things get done. And if you can't do that, then you'll be seen as a cost and an overhead rather than a business enabler. And that's the switch you really want to get into. If you're going to be successful with getting, the buy-in of the board to do things, you want to be seen as an enabler and a partner to help them do the things they want to do in the most secure way, as opposed to CISO of the house, no, they just stop me doing things. That's the old way of doing it.
Yeah, I love that. That's so interesting and so insightful. And you're absolutely right. Like no one, at the end of the day, it's not like a restaurant, restaurant scores, right? You could get a C where you pass, but no one really wants to eat there, or you get an A plus. To your point, good enough is allowing the enablement of work to continue while being secure. Over and above that, yeah, exactly. Is it Are we doing too much? And unfortunately, it's just like a binary point in time that ever tells you that, right? Like you only
Right.
know when, either by negative outcome, or like as in the absence of an outcome, nothing happens, or a legitimately negative outcome. Yeah, that's so interesting.
And I think this is where sort of continual testing can help. So,
Yeah.
you have red teams, blue teams, purple teams, the outside people coming in, pen testing, running adversarial threat exercises, even in finance, there are industry exercises. They're really useful. A lot of people are worried that internal audit are going to look at them, or the red team are going to come and test them, but actually that's where you get the best information, because if they find something that needs to be improved, then you go and improve it, and you've got something tangible as to why it needs to be improved. So I'm always very welcoming of anybody coming to test it, because that's how you start to learn stuff.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, exactly right. Because otherwise, how do you know if you're secure enough? You're just glad that another day went by and nothing happened, right? So yeah, constantly applying pressure and at the different pressure points and making sure that they still hold. That's wonderful. Well, Andy, thank you for your time today. I really appreciate you sitting down and speaking with me.
Thanks very much for inviting me. I've had a great time. Thanks.
You're welcome. Take care.